Today it's my privilege to welcome Émilien Érard, chef de cave of Charles Heidsieck. Émilien was appointed to the role in 2025, marking a quiet but significant evolution for the house. He succeeds Élise Losfelt, who departed to return to her family estate. But he also worked under Elise's predecessor, the legendary Cyril Brun. Since joining in 2018, Emilien has embedded himself deeply within the fabric of Charles Heidsieck. His work has not been defined by visibility, but by precision, overseeing the rhythms of the winery, building trusted relationships with growers, and contributing year after year to the tasting committee that shapes the house's signature. Emilien understands not only the technical architecture of the wines, but the deeper identity of Charles Heidsieck, its language of texture, patience, and quiet power. In this episode, we move beyond the surface, exploring the philosophy behind Charles Heidsieck's rosé winemaking, the quiet power of lees aging and reserve wines, and the nuanced decisions that preserve identity across challenging vintages. We also take a look at the newly released Blanc de Millénaire from the less talked about 2017 vintage. So, Emilien, it's wonderful to have you with us today. You are, of course, in Australia to celebrate the next iteration of your famed Blanc de Millénaire champagne from the 2017 vintage, but also the next tranche of vintage releases from 2018. So, Emilien, this is your first time in Australia, which is fantastic, and it's really wonderful to have you with us.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
You've been with Charles Heidsieck now since 2018 as part of the winemaking team, working very closely next to the tanks, day-to-day reality of the cellar, but also managing very closely your relationship with the growers who are critical to supplying the fruit for your champagnes. So last year you were promoted to the role of cellar master. So how does it feel taking on this role?
It's a great honor for me to take this role on last July. And when Stephen asked me the question to become chef de cave, I say yes directly, just a few years after. And I'm so happy to walk on the footprint of the previous chef de cave and continue to affirm the style of the Charles Heidsieck champagne year after year.
Yeah, fantastic. So congratulations.
Thank you.
But before we get into talking about some of the new releases, I know people are very keen to hear about them. I wanted to do just a little bit of a deeper dive into Charles Heidsieck's rosé champagne making style, because it's been quite interesting being with you the last few days. You've given me some additional information that I wasn't aware of from previous cellar masters, and it's just a really fascinating understanding into your stylistic approach, and particularly how you make rosé non-vintage style versus a vintage style, because there are some clear delineations, there are some clear differences. So your rosé approach, both with vintage and non-vintage, are among my favourites to drink. I really enjoy that style, but I really like how they're never overtly fruity. They morph into more savoury profiles over time, which I find very delicious and very compatible with food. So what are the key decisions in the cellar that helps to keep the fruitiness quite restrained?
All two rosés are very different in terms of winemaking process and style. The two are not too heavy in terms of fruitiness. They are very delicate and they're very elegant and perfectly balanced between the fruitiness and the roundness. But there are some difference between the two rosés. All non-vintage rosé is a very light rosé with a very light color, very delicate, very elegant, and to increase the level of fruitiness without using too much red wine, because we want a very lightly rosé. We work a lot on the selection of the meunier in the blending to give this fruitiness. And of course, the winemaking process of the red wine is so important too. And for the vintage rosé, as you know, we elaborate at Charles a great aging potential rosé, and we need to have a beautiful, elegant structure with very smooth tannins, not too much present, and a very elegant fruitiness, perfectly balanced and with not too much exuberance to give the possibility to age for a very long time.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about technique now, because you do use two different approaches for the non-vintage versus the vintage. You described to me yesterday about using a long cold maceration for the red wine component when it comes to the vintage styles of rosé. You want to make sure that it's not too hard, there's not too much tannin at the same time. So how do you judge the point where you have enough colour and aroma but still keeping that lightness and finesse?
We manage differently the winemaking process for non-vintage rosé and vintage rosé. For non-vintage rosé, we use only 5 to 6% of red wine in the blending, depending of the year. But for the non-vintage rosé, we want to produce a wine with a little bit more intensity and structure because we don't use too much in the blending. And that's why we produce our red wine in a special terroir for us in Lérissé. This terroir is in the south part of the Côte des Bars in south of Champagne. And in this village, the Pinot Noir grapes are very concentrate, and we follow the maturity day after day to preserve the concentration of the grapes and produce a very elegant and intense red wine without too much tannins, a lot of fruitiness. And Lérissé village is very interesting to produce this kind of red wine because in Lérissé, because it's around 200 kilometers far from us, more in the south, there is more sunny light all along the year, more or less 200 hours more than us, for example. And that's why there is a better concentration and better maturity for the Pinot Noir. And for vintage rosé, we want red wine with a lot of elegancy, a very pure fruitiness and tannins, but very smooth tannins, not too much dry tannins or tannins with some bitterness. We want very smooth tannins and a very beautiful dark color, because our vintage rosé is a little bit more colored than our rosé non-vintage. And that's why we produce this red wine from our vineyards located in Ambonnet and Bouzy. And those plots are planted by a section of clones with loose bunch grapes of Pinot Noir. And that permits us to conserve the full berries after the destemming. And with this method, we can start the maceration in stainless tronconic steel tanks with full berries. And during the first 2 days, it's like a carbonic maceration inside the berries. And it's very good to keep the fruitiness. And after 2 days, 2 days of fermentation, the berries start to be open and the juice can run outside the berries and the classic maceration start. And to protect the berries during the beginning of the fermentation for the vintage rosé, we use some carbonic ice to decrease the temperature of the harvest. In the tanks, we make like a lasagna of berries and carbonic ice. Yes, to put down the temperature from 20 degrees, more or less, to 6 to 8 degrees. And with this method, the 2 first or 3 days of maceration are more cooler and the temperature increase a little bit across those 2 or 3 first days from 6 degrees to 18 degrees, very slowly. And with this method, we extract not too much tannins and we preserve the freshness and the fruitiness from the grapes.
And so how many days, because you did say that to me yesterday, it's a very long maceration process for the vintage rosé.
For the vintage rosé, the maceration during around 11 to 12 days, because the real fermentation starts after a few days, not the first days. And it's the big difference between the red wine from vintage rosé and red wine from non-vintage rosé. The maceration from non-vintage rosé during more or less 8 to 9 days. Yeah, in terms of during of maceration, it's quite different. And we obtain with this method different style of red wine. But during the maceration, we don't make pigeage, only pumping over to preserve the berries and to don't crush too much the berries and don't give more bitterness to the juice.
So do you think that this sort of semi-carbonic effect is really the key to making sure that your red wine remains elegant, it's not extracting too much from that side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very important element to don't extract too much of structure and things.
Mm-hmm. And so how long has this method been used at Charles Heidsieck? Has it been in more recent years or has it been a long-term thing?
The using of carbonic ice starting in 2018 with this very warm year. And it's in recent past is the first vintage in August. We start harvesting our vineyards in 22 of August, not for red wine, but in generally. And the temperature are very higher if we compare with some other classic year. Mm-hmm. And that's why we use carbonic ice for the maceration of the red wine for our vintage rosé.
Yeah. All right. So that's a really interesting point to help you, I guess, manage better some of the conditions of the year. So that's a good segue, I think, into the next question. So when you compare a year like 2012 and 2018, which is what we did yesterday, where concentration comes from very different causes, what tells you that the two very different growing seasons can still arrive at a similar sense of generosity in the finished wine? So yesterday I was mentioning to you that irrespective of the conditions of the year, you get the flavor coming through, but you always get the DNA of Charles. Yeah. So how do you manage to balance that with some of the challenges, I guess, of those years?
If we compare the 2 years, 2018 was a year with a lot of sun during the summer and a very beautiful concentration, and that give some wine with a lot of generosity, a lot of roundness, a lot of fruitiness. And in 2012, there is, in the beginning of the growing season, there is some problem of cool temperature during the flowering. Mm-hmm. There is some rain after, and there is some mildew who dry some grapes and decrease the yield, and that's give quite more concentration to the grapes. And that's why in the vintage 2012 rosé, we use a little bit of red wine from Lérissé, adding to the red wine from Ambonnet to balance it. But in the vintage 2018, to give a little bit more freshness to the blending, we introduce a little bit of Chardonnay from Trini in the blending. We use this cru in Chardonnay from the vintage, the white vintage, and the vintage rosé to give a little bit more freshness in this blending and to balance a little bit more this vintage, this warm vintage.
Yeah. Yeah, Trini is very interesting. Obviously, a component of sandy soils in there as well. And I always find it brings a really great briny, salty character, which helps to elevate the freshness or the perception of freshness in the champagne wine. So it's interesting that you're starting to use that more now. I want to jump on to a topic of Charles's relationship with texture and not just freshness. There's always an element of incredible freshness and structure in the wines, but Charles is also a champion of texture, and it really is a part of the DNA of the Maison. So, you know, I just want to know from you, do you think that texture is the real signature of the house?
Yeah, for sure. The texture is the real signature of the house. Our texture is very identifiable and very iconic. And it's like a link across all our different champagne, from non-vintage to vintage. And we affirm this texture with different elements. In non-vintage, this texture is affirmed, by different elements. Firstly, the reserve wine, and the reserve wine are two roles. Affirm the texture and balance the blending to have this a lot of consistency year after year on our non-vintage. And yes, the reserve wine balance the consistency and the texture and the structure to the wine and the flavor also, to increase the texture, the smoothness, the roundness, the richness of the blending. We use a little bit of wine fermented in old oak barrels. It's another element. And in the non-vintage, depend of the cuvée, it's between 8 to 10% for the Brut Reserve or the Rosé Reserve, and between 12 to 13% for the Blanc de Blanc.
So oak is still relatively new material that you're using at Charles Heidsieck. What was the first base year that you started using the oak in?
We start using oak barrels in 2016. base. And yes, Cyril Brun, the one of the preview chef de cave, start to use that in those years. And with the using of barrels, we don't want to give a woody taste to the blending. We just want to obtain the perfect balance between the micro oxidation across the wood and the macro reduction on the yeast. Because after the fermentation, we keep the wine in barrels during between 6 to 8 months on yeast to give this richness, this generosity. And it's a very interesting element to add to the blending to give this another element of texture. And we don't use new barrels. We use only second-hand barrels of 228 liters come from Burgundy, only used for Chardonnay before. And when we buy those barrels, there are between 3 to 5 wine before. And after, we keep them during all the time. Actually, our oldest barrels are around 13 to 14 years old. Yeah.
So we've just spoken about texture, but I'd like to talk a little bit about richness. That's another DNA element of the Maison, of course. And Charles always carries a certain level of richness, fullness on the palate, but it never feels heavy.
Yeah.
So how do you create that sense of richness without losing freshness and energy on the palate?
It's a complex balance between the richness and freshness, because we don't want to obtain a blending too much on one side. It should be all the time perfectly balanced between the freshness and richness. And to obtain that, we should make the perfect pairing between the reserve wine and the base year wine. And as you know, at Charles, we have a very big collection of reserve wine. We have around more or less 100 tanks of different reserve wine, keeping tanks separate villages by villages, year by year, and grape variety by grape variety. And with this so big diversity of reserve wine, we can precisely select the perfect wine to balance the base year. And this is very important to keep the freshness and the richness. Some reserve wine give more freshness. For example, reserve wine from the year 2017 or 2008 or the iconic 1996 will give a lot of freshness. And some reserve wine give more roundness, like 2012, like 2016, 2018, for example, for the recent reserve wine. And it's very important for us to keep them separate. At the blending moment, it's very important to have all of these possibilities for the blending.
So you've been talking about reserve wine, and obviously Charles Heidsieck has some of the biggest repository of reserve wines.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested to understand a little bit more from you as to what actually happens in the wine during the aging process, and what does it mean to you? So obviously it's a relationship of time.
Yeah. During the aging, we keep the reserve wine in stainless steel tanks. And the better thing to protect them is to let those wine on fine yeast and don't touch them at all. We just taste them 2 times a year. But if we don't need to take a part of the tank, we let all the time the tank in the same place. For example, when I joined the company in 2018, there is a tank of Verzy 2008. The name of the tank is F9. And 8 years after, the same wine from Verzy 2008 is always in the same tank. Because this wine is wonderful with a very, very delicate freshness, a lot of length. And this wine is still young. And for the moment, we don't use it. And we keep in the same tanks all the time. Another element for the balance between freshness and roundness is using of non-malolactic wine. And we start to use a little part of non-malolactic wine from 2018 on this warm harvest. And every year we keep a little bit of wine without malolactic fermentation in reserve, between 5 to 10 tanks, depending on the year. And with this method, we have some reserve wine with a lot of freshness. And it's very good to have more diversity and more option to balance the using of reserve wine with the base year wine.
How important is it for you as cellar master to build more and more reserve wine to make it available to you in the future? Because clearly, your sales keep on going up. There's more and more demand for your champagnes. Reserve wine component is really important for your style. And there would have to be pressures sometimes around the supply of all of that. So do you have a plan in place to build more reserve wine stock for future use?
Our reserve wine stock is very in link with our production, and we manage it to be all the time in balance. We have, in proportion, a big reserve wine stock in link with our production. But first focus for reserve wine is the quality. We don't put medium quality wine in reserve. We just put top quality wine in reserve because it's our treasure, and it's very important for us to have the better wine in reserve to help us every year in the blending of non-vintage wine. And the quantity is very important, but the quality is, I think, most important.
Yeah. All right. So I want to get on now to Blanc de Millénaire 2017. So this is a brand new release from the Maison from a year that was somewhat challenging, but you've done a brilliant job of it. So Blanc de Millénaire has such a strong and very consistent identity. So what kind of changes do you need to make to preserve the spirit of the wine, especially when it comes to some of those more challenging elements, particularly when the vintage doesn't give you all of the historical, I guess, information that you would normally use to create a Blanc de Millénaire?
Historically, the recipe of Blanc de Millénaire was found on like a pentagon of the 5 villages of the Côte des Blancs. As you know, Blanc de Millénaire is the quintessence of Côte des Blancs. It's the top quality of the Côte des Blancs on a special vintage, and all the time on the most top quality vintage for Côte des Blancs. And this pentagon is all the time on Le Mesnil-sur-Oger, Auger, Avise, Cramant, and Vertu. 4 Grand Cru and 1 Premier Cru. But, as you know, 2017 was a difficult year in Champagne because there is a lot of cool temperature and rain during the June and July. And this year was quite difficult for black grapes, especially. But the conditions were perfect for Chardonnay, especially in Côte des Blancs. And that's why the enology team and the preview chef de cave adapt a little bit the recipe in this Blanc de Millénaire 2017 to preserve the style of the Blanc de Millénaire. Because there is a recipe, but there is a style. And one of the most important thing is to preserve the style, preserve the longevity of this cuvée and the aging potential of this cuvée. Because the Blanc de Millénaire is a cuvée you can drink after 8 to 10 years after bottling, but this cuvée can be aged during 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's very important to have this high quality and this high aging potential.
Yeah.
And in 2017, in this quite rainy year, the style of the vintage is a little bit more austere, a little bit more on the balance on the freshness, but maybe too much at the beginning. That's why the team and the chef de cave choose to include in the blending a little bit of chouilly to give a little bit more roundness and generosity. But they integrate chouilly to balance the blending, and also because in the end of August there is some hailstorm in Cramant, and those hailstorms destroy a part of the harvest, and the opportunities of blending with Cramant are reduced a lot, and that's why they choose chouilly. Chouilly, as you know, is very close to Cramant, and the two terroirs are side by side. The end of Cramant is the beginning of chouilly. There is just a little difference in the style because of the slope of chouilly are more flat if we compare with slope of Cramant, who are a little bit more steep, and that's why there is a little bit more freshness and length on Cramant and more roundness and generosity on chouilly. And it's very interesting in this kind of vintage to use this diversity in those two Grand Cru and make the switch between Cramant and chouilly.
So there's no Cramant at all, or a little bit of Cramant?
No Cramant at all.
No Cramant at all. Okay. It's very interesting because obviously Blanc de Millénaire, as you mentioned, has always been built on the 5 cru. It's always been a very clear part of the DNA. So this inclusion of Shui and removal of Cremant, I'm just wondering from your perspective, do you think that looking into the future, that there could be some movement when it comes to the identity of Blanc de Millénaire, that it might still retain everything that we know, the flavor, the aromatic profile, but perhaps that's coming from different areas?
As you know, the climate change, and it's not all the time on the warm temperature. Sometimes it can be on cool temperature. And this climate change can create some nuances and differences in the growing season between each villages, in generally, but in the Côte des Blancs too. And if we are focused on the quality and on the aging potential, it's good for us to be a little bit open-minded, and why not introduce Chouilly if we need? It's a Grand Cru, and we can introduce a little bit of Chouilly to balance the blending. And the other element is not also on the list of the villages, but we can play with the proportion of each villages. In the first historic recipe, the blending is more or less 20% of each villages. But in the 2017, the proportion is not on 20% of each. There is a little majority of Le Milly-sur-Roger and a little minority of Chouilly, because Chouilly is just 8%.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. That's really interesting.
Thank you so much.
So I want to, as we're closing out, I just want to get on to a little bit more about you and I guess some of your personal opinions and also some of your memories that you've had so far at Charles Heidsieck. You've been there since 2018, as I've mentioned. You've been part of a couple of other Chef de Cave experiences, and you've been a really integral part to the winemaking team. You've also had the experience of incredible champagnes to drink as well. And I just want to know from you, so what are some of your favorite experiences or memories that you've had so far in your Charles Heidsieck journey?
I think the most incredible experience that I have at Charles, it's not just one day, because it's quite too long to do that in one day, but it's 4 years ago, I think, with Cyril and the rest of the enology team. We make a big exploring in the Enothèque across the Crayère, and we make a very incredible tasting of each or non-vintage, each or mise en cave, and each or of our vintage, classic vintages, rosé vintages, Cuvée Royale, Cuvée Charlie, and Blanc des Millénaires. And it was incredible to taste every bottle side by side on their different steps, because some bottles are conserved sur pointe, some bottles are conserved with the first disgorgement, some bottles are conserved on yeast, and there is a very interesting diversity. And
and so what was the point of that? What was the intention on doing something like that?
Yeah, it's we do that to make bilan, a point on situation of all the wine in the Enothèque, in the Crayère, and evaluate all the potential and the quality of each vintage across the time at the moment. And it was incredible. And I think it's the kind of tasting we can do
all the time.
We want to do all the time, but we can do maybe just one or two times in a life.
That would be fantastic. It sounds absolutely incredible. What a privilege. And just lastly, to round it out, what opportunities are you looking forward to as Chef de Cave? Well, what things are you looking forward to? Do you have a personal agenda? Are you passionate about something in particular?
I try to do everything, because, for example, 2 weeks ago, we finalized the blending of the Brut Reserve for Charles, and it's very exciting for me, because it's the first time I have to create the blending of the Brut Reserve for Charles. And it was a special moment for me, special moment for the team. And in this moment, I need to be in very good links with all the team to understand and to hear all what we say about the different tastes that I make to obtain the perfect blending. I think in this year it was one of the most important moments for me. This traveling in Australia was very special for me because it's my first big travel for Charles. And I make this travel with Stephen, and it's very interesting to travel and to share this moment with Stephen. I learned a lot of things. The next vintage, I'm very excited to be at the next harvest in this new role, because the harvest 2025 was so intense for me, because during this harvest I was cut in two roles, the roles of chef de cave and the roles of winery manager. And for the vintage 2026, I can be focused on the role of the chef de cave. And yes, I think it will be exciting.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for giving us a beautiful insight into Charles. I wish you every success going forward and looking forward to seeing a very long journey for you ahead with Charles, and have a wonderful and successful rest of your trip.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Wine & Bubble is a boutique and independent information source dedicated exclusively to telling the real story of Champagne. It was launched by me, Sarah Underdown, in November 2018, after almost a decade of working in the champagne industry as a recognised writer, educator and presenter. Wine & Bubble brings together a network of Australian wine journalists, sommeliers, educators and industry representatives as regular contributors. As a team of champagne lovers and communicators, we are thrilled to share our united passion with wine-loving audiences. To read more about Champagne, to subscribe to events in Australia and learn more about opportunities to join us for experiences in Champagne, visit wineandbubble.com and register your details.